Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of If You Have to Pick Three. It's Matt.
And it's Zach.
We come up with all sorts of different lists for this show, and, well, we pick three each and pick a final three. Hence,
sometimes it gets ugly, sometimes it gets emotionally draining. What can I say?
Speaking of draining, this one was really draining because, well, you clicked on the picture. You know what we're about to do here. This is If You Have to Pick Three top grunge albums. Zach, why don't you hit them with a little bit more?
Well, if we want to talk about grunge music in general, I mean, so many journalists, so many fans, so many bands have gone on and on and on about the impact of grunge, to the point that I'm a little surprised we have not done the best grunge albums pick three episode before. I think what really inspired us to do it this year is that in 2021, Matt, sorry, I'm going to make you feel old. Not only does Nirvana's Nevermind turn 30 years old, not only does Pearl Jam's 10 turn 30 years old, but also Soundgarden's Badmotorfinger turn 30 years old. I mean, these are classic 90s rock albums, not even grunge albums, just 90s rock albums that really reshaped how hard rock music looked, sound, felt for many years and decades to come. So I thought it would be fitting that we duke it out over what we would declare as the best grunge albums. However, Matt, I think it's also only fair that we have some stipulations, namely that neither of us can choose Nirvana's Nevermind or Pearl Jam's 10. Because if you think about the two albums that automatically come to mind when you think of grunge or even just alt rock, it's Nevermind and 10. So I say the rule is that we can't pick either album. You okay with that, Matt?
Yeah, we're good.
But before we go into our picks, shout out to Rootless Coffee Co., one of our sponsors. They're a small batch roaster out of Flint, Michigan. They really brew some interesting, fun flavors. I mean, it's a great segue into craft coffee, as they like to kind of say. As you know, no secret, Matt and I love coffee.
They got some really good stuff over there. And I've actually tried what they call a damn fine cup of coffee and berry kiss. And if you like even like a little bit of flavor in your coffee, the berry kiss is perfect with nothing in it. And a damn fine cup of coffee is really that. It's nice and smooth. And what I love about them the most is some coffee companies, they try to like throw a ton of caffeine in them and you're left with the jitters. This is just a nice, smooth cup of coffee. You have a couple, you're real good. I love it.
Head over to rootlesscoffee.com. And when you check out, use the code EPICROAST and you'll receive 15% off of your order of coffee blends that break free from boring. So Matt, you know, they're based out of Flint, Michigan, but you know what other city produces some amazing coffee?
I'm guessing since this is the grunge episode, you want me to say Seattle.
Did you know Seattle? And you know what else came out of Seattle? Grunge. Boom. Let's talk about best grunge albums. Matt, I'll let you go first.
All right. So you want me to be the one who gets heckled first in the comments because I didn't pick the deepest grunge album that I could think of.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Just as long as we're clear on that. Fine. All right. First, I'm going with the one that had the most impact on me back when I was a wee youngin' listening to this stuff for the first time. And back in '96, some could say that this was kind of a little late for grunge, but you know, that was the time when I first discovered Bush. And yes, but everybody can make a pun. Go ahead. All right, good. Now that we got that out of the way. So the first time that I heard Bush actually was on Razorblade's Suitcase. And I remember thinking, man, this is really dark. This is really good. And who are these guys? So I really loved Greedy Fly. And then I got into Mouth, and they had that remix that came out to Mouth for, I forget which movie it was. I think it was for one of the Crow movies. I could be wrong. Anyway, I'm not going with that because soon after I discovered Razorblade Suitcase, I went back to Coconuts. Yes, the music store Coconuts. And I picked up 16 Stone. And 16 Stone completely blew my mind from the first track all the way to the last track. I mean, there are so many really good songs on 16 Stone. If you've never taken the chance to listen to any other of the tracks, obviously, than the singles. And what's interesting about this album is that the singles, they were released from the end of 94, like September of 94, all the way through April of 96. Which is kind of crazy to me that 2 years later, they're still releasing singles for this album when it's been out for so long. Obviously, Everything Zen, Little Things Come Down, Machine Head, Glycerine, everybody knows those. But some of my other favorite ones on here are Swim and Alien. I like Ex-Girlfriend too. So if you've never taken the chance to go through 16 Stone, really give it a deep listen. And one of the things that I love about this album, and it's also going to go into one of my other picks on here, is just the dirt and the fuzz that you get on Gavin Rossdale's Stratocaster on this particular album. It's just so good. And when you hear him perform it live today, he really does stay true to the sound of the album, and he still uses the Strat, still uses all that heavy fuzz on it, and it's just so good. So if you haven't listened to it in a while, or really, like I said, given it a deep listen, go back and listen to it again. So number 1 is 16 Stone. Number 2, I'll go into this one too because I started to tease it a little bit. So one of the things that I loved about Bush and 16 Stone was, like I said, the dirt and the fuzz. And another band that kind of did that, and they mixed it in and out of their songs, but a lot of what became Soundgarden's Superunknown, it's just a classic album from start to finish. I mean, everybody knows Superunknown. This is one of the best vocal performances I can think of on an album from Chris Cornell. You can't argue with anything that's on this album. And one of the things that I love, especially about this album, is just the many different sounds that they get on here. Like on songs like on Fresh Tendrils and 4th of July, you get that almost doom stoner type fuzz sound where it's kind of even pushing the boundaries of, is this still grunge anymore? But then they come back with Black Hole Sun, Spoon Man, The Day I Tried to Live, My Wave, Fell on Black Days. I mean, I can keep going on and on here, but there was a reason why this album was so special when it was just re-released, and they made such a big deal about it. And you forget that these albums are classic for a reason, because Zach and I, we talked about this a while ago when Chris Cornell first passed. Soundgarden is always that band that was there, and they always put out classic music, and they always just put out good music. And to some, I think they took Soundgarden for granted. And if you never got a chance to see Chris Cornell like I did, I never had a chance, you always thought that, oh, you know what? I'll get to a Soundgarden show. I'll get to a Soundgarden show. And then unfortunately that's what happened. And here we are all these years later, and now we're looking back on these albums so fondly and just taking it in again that, Soundgarden was this force. As much as they were overshadowed by other bands, Nirvana, I think, completely overshadowed what Soundgarden actually did, because Soundgarden was around for quite some time prior to these albums. But coming back around, and the theme of this episode, Superunknown, while some people, I think, look at it now as like overplayed because, let's face it, it's getting, and it has gotten so much radio play over the years that, there are some other albums like maybe Badmotorfinger or Down on the Upside that aren't played as much, and people are liking those albums a little bit more. How many times can I hear Black Hole Sun again? But if you sit and listen to it in the right environment and just take it in, I mean, Superunknown is just one of those albums that you need to sit down and listen to start to finish, and just one of the albums that really defined a generation. So Superunknown, number 2. And then finally, one of the hardest things that I had to do when I was going through the album list that I wanted to potentially put on here was to figure out which one of my favorite bands' albums to throw on here. Because let's face it, Alice in Chains has an incredible catalog. And I was even thinking about doing one of the not the brand new, but the newer albums like Rainier Fog. And some people can be like, wait, that's not grunge. It didn't come out in the 90s and blah, blah, blah. But you listen to it and it's still Alice in Chains. I know Layne isn't around anymore and Layne is not on them, but Will does a fantastic job and the band does such a great job that they really found the right person for the job. Now, imagine Soundgarden trying to throw in somebody for Chris Cornell. You got to find like 1 in a billion to fill the shoes. So it is really hard to do, but I decided not to stir the pot with doing one of the new albums. So I decided, let's go real classic. And we're going with 1992's Dirt. This album, from start to finish, kicks you in the teeth with Them Bones as the opening track, and then Damn That River. And then they go into like their softer side. You know, like the 80s, every bad boy had their soft side. Well, this is Alice in Chains really kind of showing their soft side on here with Rain When I Die and Down in a Hole, really personal tracks to Layne. And then Rooster. I mean, if you can't love Rooster and just those pure energy that they kick in and out of that song, and seeing it live, my God, years later with Will, the guys still have it. I mean, I loved every single track on here. And fun fact, if you didn't know, that the band Godsmack got their name from the track Godsmack on this album. So that just shows you how influential Alice in Chains was to other bands that even started taking, the track names as new band names. But to round out the album, 2 other singles, Angry Chair and Wood on here, there's just not one bad song on here. And once again, if you haven't taken the time to listen to this album outside of the singles, you're missing out. So that's my 3. My rant's over. To recap, 16 Stone, Dirt, Alice in Chains, of course, and Superunknown from Soundgarden. What say you, Mr. Zach?
Well, first off, thank you for not going with one of the newer Alice in Chains albums over. Only because now I love Rainier Fog. Actually, that was one of the first episodes. The very first 2 minutes to review episode we ever did was on Rainier Fog. Album of the 2018 for hands down. And I agreed that they still sound phenomenal. But when you have an album like Dirt, you can't choose the newer album over that. Or even
yes, you can.
And I'm actually going to preface what I'm about to into going to my list. I actually purposefully decided not to. I didn't want to make this rule for you, Max. I knew it'd be too hard for your brain. But I purposefully, check my brain. Boom, Alice in Chains reference. Anyway, I purposefully decided not to choose a Soundgarden and Alice in Chains album because I found myself spending way too much time myself debating, all right, should it be Badmotorfinger or Superunknown? Should it be Facelift or should it be Dirt? And just like ping-ponging back and forth as to like which album to choose between those 2 bands. I was like, you know what? No, fine. Just for the sake of my own sanity, I decided to eliminate those albums from my list. So, with that said, this is the first pick. Admittedly, I was actually about to disqualify this title simply because technically it's an EP. And over the years, there's been a lot of different additions to this special release that's kind of combined other singles and messed around the track listing. But I couldn't because Mudhoney is quite frankly probably one of the most underrated influences of not just grunge, but 90s rock in general. And of course, I'm talking about Superfuzz Bigmuff. I mean, you listen to songs like Touch Me, I'm Sick, and In and Out of Grace. I mean, the distorted sound, the gritty vibe to it, it really does capture what Seattle grunge sounded like and just felt like. And it was also a good 3+ years before Nirvana, quote, introduced grunge to the mainstream. I mean, I think there's countless artists who even said that if it wasn't for Mudhoney and even Superfuzz Bigmuff specifically, that bands like Nirvana would never even get a chance to be recognized by a label. You know, and they found some success on their own during the 90s once, you know, the big 4 grunge, you can argue, kind of broke it into the mainstream, but they really don't get enough credit for the influence that they've had on the whole scene. So that kind of is a nice segue to my second pick, because like Mudhoney, this band really also doesn't get enough credit for the influence they've had on grunge and just 90s rock. I'm talking about Melvins. Buzz Osborne actually is such a huge presence in the Seattle scene. He influenced Kurt Cobain to a certain degree. I mean, they were friends with Nirvana and Kurt. The album I actually choose is technically co-produced by Kurt Cobain himself, even though the level of involvement he had in the album's production is highly debatable. I mean, I think even Buzz himself has said, yeah, while we were recording Houdini, Kurt was just not in a place to contribute at all to the overall sound. But regardless of whether or not he really contributed it, 1993's Houdini, their first major label release, it just really captured the heavier, sludgier sound of grunge. I mean, you can even argue it's almost like a doom metal album. I mean, songs like Hooch and Hag Me and Set Me Straight, there's just so many songs that just like, you just feel the dirt. Kind of like going with Alice in Chains too. Like you can talk about the album dirt. You just feel the grittiness and the sludginess. And you can't listen to the song Going Blind by Kiss ever the same once you hear their cover. You listen to it, it's like, man, they definitely got a little bit of a White Zombie vibe. You can kind of tell where Rob Zombie got his influences from. This album, I think, is a great example of only in the early to mid 90s could this be released by a mainstream label. In fact, the Melvins did a few releases with Atlantic Records, and when they left the label, someone, I guess, asked Buzz, like, hey, so I guess now you can feel free to do whatever you want. You don't have to feel like you have to please the label. And he was like, did you hear what we did with Houdini? It really is a great example of the darker, more heavier sound that mainstream rock was going through at the time. So Melvins Houdini, my second pick. The third pick, and this was a little hard because I mean, there's so many different albums I wanted to pick, some a little bit more obvious, some even deeper, but I feel like this one, I really wanted to give a moment to shine because the band and album don't get enough credit, but I think a lot of average fans write it off simply because of who was the front woman and also when the album came out. I'm sure that might be enough of a clue, but I'm talking about Holes Live Through This. It's easy to pinpoint, unfairly easy to pinpoint Courtney Love's just whole persona as kind of overshadowing how great and how powerful of a frontwoman she really is. And I think also the death of Kurt Cobain. I mean, because keep in mind, this was Hole's first major label release, and it came out, I think maybe just a few days after Kurt Cobain committed suicide. And that definitely overshadowed it. But really, I mean, it really highlighted the jingly hooks and punk vibe that grunge has. I mean, talk about bands like Alice in Chains and Melvins, it's definitely heavier, doomier. And then you had more punkish kind of vibe live through this. I think Rolling Stone actually described this album when they were naming the 50 top grunge albums. They kind of nicely described it as a roller coaster reflection on codependency, motherhood, and feminism. I mean, it really is true. This really is an anthem for 90s feminism. I know it sounds weird coming from a white male, but it really does capture a lot of the standout elements of grunge, the angst, the frustration, and the overall aggression with some sensitive moments still incorporated in it. So I just felt like I wanted to give a little shout out to Holes Live Through This. So to recap, my top three includes Mudhoney, Superfuzz, Bigmuff, Melvins Houdini, and Holes Live Through This. And before we duke it out over the final three, two things, Matt. First, I want to give a quick shout out to a band called L7. I think their album Bricks Are Heavy is really just criminally underrated. Kind of similar to Hole, the female members, but just really heavy with still a punk attitude. It's almost more like in lines of like heavy Motorhead than it is with more of the punk and doomy aspects of grunge. And then, Matt, I want to get your opinion on something before we decide the final three.
Okay.
I kind of think I know your answer because you chose Bush.
Mm-hmm.
60 Stones is one of your picks. But Smashing Pumpkins and Stone Temple Pilots, do you consider them grunge?
Do I consider them grunge?
Because if I'm going to be frank, I would consider them more grunge than a band like Bush. All with no disrespect to Bush. But I also have, like, for instance, I was toying with Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, amazing album that we both declared as one of the best albums of 1995. The epicness of it was a refreshing take on the grungy alt rock sound of the times, but I had a hard time saying that was, to me, what grunge sounded like. And kind of similar to Stone Temple Pilots' Purple, I mean, Interstate Love Song, one of the best rock songs in the 90s, hands down. But I have a hard time saying that album, as great as it is what I think of as grunge. So would you disagree, agree? Thoughts on this?
I always considered, let's go with the Smashing Pumpkins first. I always considered them to be more alternative. But then again, you could always argue that grunge was the alternative.
Yeah.
So I just never really lumped the Smashing Pumpkins in there. But then again, they weren't really my favorite, so I can't say
maybe
yay or
biased.
nay. Maybe, but I just never put them in there. And then, while Melancholy is really good, but it's good for a whole different set of reasons. It's not, brash and beat you in the face with fuzz and with just attitude, which is a lot of what grunge was. So it's good from, what else can you do if you try to make a more grown-up album? Because let's face it, when Nirvana did Nevermind, it's a completely different Nirvana than when they did In Utero. I think In Utero was their grown-up album, and it was received. It was received well, nothing compared to Nevermind. So I think that with the Smashing Pumpkins and Melancholy, that was their grown-up album, coming from albums like Siamese Dream and Gish. I never really liked Gish, and I'm gonna catch some hell for it, but I just never did. I never liked it, and Siamese Dream caught me here and there, but it really just never really did it for me. So to ask me about the Smashing Pumpkins, I mean, from a pure journalistic perspective, I can understand why there's so much hype, or not hype anymore, really, but I can understand why people like the Smashing Pumpkins and why they are influential and why they were so big at the time. I get it. I can see it. But to me,
But now, I know you're a huge Stone Temple Pilots fan. You even said that they should be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as soon as possible. Do you consider them? I have a hard time. I know that they, maybe it's because it kind of goes back to, and spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that Bush should not be in the final three. But to me, bands like Stone Temple Pilots and Bush, similar time frame, but I felt like they were a lot in a different, more in the rock level and the more in the post grunge spectrum of 90s alt rock. Would you agree to that?
Well, you're talking. See, you're talking Purple. I'm not going Purple. If anything, I would talk more about Core, and I think
that's more of a grunge album.
I think it definitely is. And just he always had it, but the swagger of Scott Weiland just came through so much better on Core, in my opinion, than it did on Purple. It's from a grunge perspective. I think that they probably were the more radio-friendly version of what grunge could be. Because let's face it, until Nirvana, came through, and for all intents and purposes, you got to think of Smells Like Teen Spirit as this is the song that we want to hit the radio. Before how big it became, they came into this album with a purpose. There was a lot of buzz around them, and there was a lot of stuff with Nirvana at the time. What the hell was the name of that song that they put out? On Bleach, on About a Girl, that's it. About a Girl was the single that they came out with, and you could kind of see where they were going. And, it did get some radio play, and it was getting them some attention. So they had to come out with something. The record company obviously wanted them to come out with something that was going to hit the radio. And, well, what did they come out with? Smells Like Teen Spirit. And it was the most radio-friendly, I think, grunge has ever sounded. So every band kind of had to model themselves around getting that sound. And for the Stone Temple Pilots, it to me Encore sounded like they were trying to imitate what Nevermind or what Smells Like Teen Spirit did, and it just happened to come through as almost a whole album. But Scott Weiland and the way that he presented himself made up for the fact that the music wasn't as dirty as, you know, we would see with Alice in Chains or Soundgarden or anything else on Nevermind. You know, they presented themselves in a much more radio-friendly way with this outlandish frontman. So I would consider that album to be way more grunge than Purple, but the Stone Temple Pilots are always trying to be, I think, that radio-friendly version of Nirvana for all intents and purposes.
That's fair. Now, before, again, I want to kind of touch on this before we determine the final three. I'm really milking this out, I know. As I mentioned before I chose my list, I was struggling between Facelift versus Dirt when it came to Alice in Chains albums. While Facelift definitely was probably one of the earliest, like, whoa moments in the hard rock scene when it came to the Seattle sound and grunge, in the mainstream at least. I kind of was leaning more towards Dirt when it came to like what really solidified or what really exemplified what grunge was. But I was having a harder time choosing between Superunknown and Badmotorfinger. And I was kind of leaning towards Badmotorfinger actually, because while Superunknown, phenomenal album, we even named it as one of the best albums of 1994. To me, that was their grown-up album. That was them being a little bit more experimental and showing what more you can do beyond the typical tropes of hard rock and grunge. Whereas Badmotorfinger, it just kind of, you could play that and someone would be like, oh, okay, this is what grunge is. It makes sense. So in my mind, at least. What was going through your mind though when you decided? And did you at all have a debate between Superunknown versus Badmotorfinger, or was it always no Superunknown?
No, it's always been Superunknown for me. I mean, I do obviously like the singles that they put on there. So for those who don't know, Rusty Cage outshined, I mean, even to a much lesser extent, maybe Jesus Christ Pose, but
that was definitely a good big single. Yeah.
It's
a standout for the band.
It's a standout, but it's not anywhere near Rusty Cage or Outshined. None of the other tracks on there really did it for me. Like, I always go back to the title of Room 1,000 Years Wide. That always kind of like messes with my mind, thinking about a room 1,000 years wide. That's a pretty big room, but I don't know. I wasn't the hugest fan of Badmotorfinger. I just think that they hit their stride and they really nailed who Soundgarden was on Superunknown. They took all of their prior elements and all of, even like to a lesser extent, like when they weren't even anywhere near as polished, all the way back on like Louder Than Love in '89. Like, if they took everything that they learned prior and brought it into Superunknown, and this is the Soundgarden that everybody, I think, references when you think of Soundgarden. Not just because of Black Hole Sun, but, you know, like I said, The Day I Tried to Live, you get to actually see Chris Cornell and how he blossomed as a vocalist. And when you get into songs like I mentioned earlier, like Fresh Tendrils and 4th of July, this is really them showing their doomier, sludgier sides with all of that deep grit and fuzz, but still Chris Cornell standing out really hard against it. It's just, I think, almost a perfect album when you're talking how far can you go before the wheels fall off. Because if you go any more doomy than what they did, Chris Cornell is not going to sound right in that band. And you don't take it so far to the other side where you're just trying to pump out radio singles and sound, you know, radio friendly like, you know, the Stone Temple Pilots. I think they kind of hit it right smack in the middle of, hey, maybe if Nevermind wasn't as big as it was, this would have been the standout album that everybody would be referencing.
I'm going to make a proposition, the infamous Zach proposition.
Okay.
So absolutely Soundgarden, Superunknown, and Alice in Chains' Dirt in the final three. Absolutely. Okay. Dirt is just a perfect album. It really showed how heavy grunge could be. Alice in Chains was the most metal band out of the major big bands of grunge. I mean, they really wore borderline Black Sabbath when Nirvana was trying to be more punk and Pearl Jam was trying to be more classic rock. And I mean, can you think of a better song than Wood or Them Bones? And then you then find like a slower, more ballady song like Down in a Hole, which is even when, you know, before the heavy guitars kick in, just eeriness of it and the beauty of it. It's just, I mean, there's a reason why a song like that, and really most of their songs sound just as emotionally heavy acoustic as they do electric. And I think Dirt just captures what is so perfect about Alice in Chains. So absolutely that one. And Superunknown, we can go on hours and hours on how great that album is too. We kind of already started to. Before I make a suggestion about that third, because I think it's only fair that the final of the final three comes from my list. Matt, which of my three would you pick to fill that last spot? I have an idea of what I would pick, but I'm curious what you, because I can be kind of persuaded. So which one of my three would you pick? And if you'd like me to explain why I chose those again, you should just pause and listen to what I said before, because I don't feel like repeating. And before you try to ask, no, we are not picking Bush's 16 Stones. Sorry.
Damn it.
Damn it. I'm a little shocked. Because to me, that's a post-grunge band. I never really...
That's 94, though. It's like right there.
I still call it as punch, but not the point.
Well, you sounded like you were behind the Melvins a little bit more than you were behind Mudhoney. So let's go with the Melvins. You know, it's funny you say that, though, because I was actually going to say that was going to be my last pick for the final spot of it all. I was actually leaning towards Mudhoney. Okay, so Mudhoney it was actually tied between Mudhoney and Hole, surprisingly, because I think part of it is I don't think Hole get enough credit for what they contributed to the scene, but I'm going to go with Mudhoney. I love Melvins. I love Houdini. I think it's, again, a great example of what just gritty grunge sounds like, but I kind of shocked myself because, you know, EP, I'm a stickler for that kind of those things, but I think without Mudhoney, you can make the argument that really there would be no grunge. There would be no Soundgarden. There would be no Alice in Chains to a certain degree. I'm sure they'd find ways to get around it, but like Mudhoney does not get enough credit for what they contributed to the Seattle sound, or at least not by mainstream publications. So I'm actually going to go with, to my own surprise too, because I feel like if you ask me tomorrow, I might change my mind. But I'm going to go with Mudhoney's Superfuzz Bigmuff. So there you go. So let's just recap then. The final three, the best grunge albums, parentheses, not including Nirvana's Nevermind or Pearl Jam's 10. In case you kind of skipped over the intro and we made the announcement, no, we are not including those two great albums, because without a doubt, those would be in a list like this. But let's have fun and not name those two. Final three, Alice in Chains' Dirt, Soundgarden's Superunknown, and Mudhoney's Superfuzz Bigmuff. That's just a fun title to say. Do you agree with our final three list? Do you agree with our picks? Do you think we are way off, that we need an education, a 101 course of grunge? Let us know on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Epic Footnote. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more podcasts like this, as well as check out some cool videos. And thank you again to our sponsor, Rootless Coffee Co. Again, go to rootlesscoffee.com. Use the code EPICROAST to receive 15% off of your order of coffee blends that break free from boring. And also don't forget about our other sponsor, Lucky 13 Beard Co. Head on over to lucky13beardco.com. Beard balms and oils, small batch made, fresh when you order them, so you feel as good as you possibly can when you get them. 10% off your order at checkout. Use the code EFP10, lucky13beardco.com. Coffee and beards. I mean, how fitting is that for an episode about grunge? We don't have anything about flannel. Maybe that could be our next sponsor. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you join us for another episode real soon. See ya.